The red clay soil of Georgia holds many secrets. In the spring of 2008, in a small town where neighbors knew each other by first name and front doors remained unlocked through summer nights, one of those secrets would be buried deep. On April 12, 2008, in Covington, Georgia, a young woman named Michelle Parker vanished from her modest rental home on Elm Street. She was 26 years old, a waitress at the local diner, and a mother to a 3-year-old daughter named Emma. When her shift supervisor called that Saturday evening wondering why Michelle hadn't shown up for work, nobody could have imagined that 15 years would pass before the truth finally surfaced. What happened in those quiet morning hours before noon, in a house with faded yellow shutters and a chain-link fence surrounding a small backyard? And why did the one person who should have been most desperate to find her seem so strangely, unnervingly calm? Covington sits about 35 miles east of Atlanta, nestled in Newton County where pine forests give way to farmland, and the pace of life moves slower than the traffic on Interstate 20. In 2008, the town carried a population just under 12,000 souls. Main Street still had a functioning hardware store, a pharmacy with a soda fountain, and that diner where Michelle worked the early shift 4 days a week. The houses along Elm Street were built in the 1950s, modest single-story structures with carports instead of garages, where working families raised children and tended small gardens. Michelle had moved into number 42 Elm Street in January of that year, just 3 months before she disappeared. She rented the place for $600 a month. The landlord, an elderly man named Walter Simmons, would later tell investigators that Michelle always paid on time, kept the yard neat, and never caused any trouble. Michelle Parker grew up in the neighboring town of Social Circle, the middle child in a family of 5. Her father worked at a textile mill until it closed in 2001. Her mother cleaned houses. Michelle graduated from Newton County High School in 2000, where she ran track and sang in the church choir. Friends from those years remembered her as quiet but warm, someone who laughed easily and looked out for the younger kids in the neighborhood. She met David Parker at a 4th of July barbecue in 2004. David was 28 then, worked construction, and drove a white Ford F-150 that he kept meticulously clean. They married that November in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Emma was born the following September. Those who knew Michelle during her marriage said she changed. The easy laughter came less frequently. She stopped attending church. Her younger sister, Jessica, visited the Elm Street house twice in those early months of 2008 and noticed bruises on Michelle's arms that Michelle explained away as accidents at work, though Jessica had her doubts. Michelle's mother, Carol, would later testify that her daughter had called her on April 10, 2 days before she vanished, and said she was thinking about asking David to move out. Carol told her to be careful, to maybe wait until she had saved more money, but Michelle said she couldn't wait much longer. April 12, 2008 dawned clear and cool. The temperature sat at 58 degrees at sunrise. A light breeze moved through the pine trees that lined the back property line. Michelle's neighbor across the street, and retired schoolteacher named Patricia Hallbrook, was watering her azaleas at 7:30 that morning when she saw Michelle step out onto her front porch. Michelle wore jeans and a blue sweater. She waved. Patricia waved back. Michelle went back inside. That was the last confirmed sighting of Michelle Parker alive. David Parker told investigators that he left for work at 6:45 that morning. He said Michelle was still asleep. He said Emma was asleep too, in her small bedroom with the pink walls and the stuffed animals arranged on shelves David had built himself. David worked for Reynolds Construction, a local company that specialized in commercial roofing. The job site that Saturday was in Monroe, about 20 minutes north. David's supervisor, Tom Reynolds, confirmed that David arrived at the site around 7:15 and worked until approximately 11:30, when he said he needed to go home to check on Michelle because she wasn't answering her phone. Tom said David seemed distracted that morning, kept checking his cell phone, didn't talk much with the other crew members. David returned to Elm Street just before noon. He pulled into the carport. The front door was unlocked. He called Michelle's name, no answer. He walked through the small living room with its beige carpet and second-hand furniture. The kitchen was empty. A coffee mug sat on the counter half full, the coffee gone cold. Michelle's purse was on the dining table. Her wallet was inside, along with her identification and $63 in cash. Her car keys hung on the hook by the back door. Her cell phone was plugged in on the kitchen counter, charging. David checked the bathroom, empty. He checked the bedroom. The bed was made. He checked Emma's room. Emma was not there. At 12:14, David called Newton County Emergency Services. The recording of that call would be played many times in the years that followed. David's voice was steady, almost flat. He reported that his wife was missing and so was their daughter. The dispatcher asked how long they had been gone. David said he didn't know. He had been at work since early morning. The dispatcher asked if there were signs of a struggle. David said no. Everything looked normal, but Michelle's car was still there and her purse was still there, so where could she be? The dispatcher said officers were on the way. Deputy Marshal Green arrived at 12:29. He was a 10-year veteran of the Newton County Sheriff's Office, had responded to hundreds of calls, and had developed an instinct for when something felt wrong. He found David Parker standing in the carport, arms crossed, looking at the closed front door as if waiting for someone to answer. Deputy Green introduced himself and asked David to walk him through the house. They entered through the front door. Deputy Green noticed immediately that the house was extraordinarily neat. No dishes in the sink. No toys scattered on the floor. The trash can was empty, a fresh liner in place. The vacuum cleaner sat in the corner of the living room, and when Deputy Green ran his hand over the carpet, he could feel the fresh vacuum lines. Deputy Green asked David when he had last seen Michelle and Emma. David repeated what he had told the dispatcher. He left for work before 7. They were both asleep. He came home around noon and they were gone. Deputy Green asked if Michelle had mentioned any plans for the day. David said no. Deputy Green asked if there had been any arguments recently. David hesitated, then said they had disagreed about money sometimes, but nothing serious. Deputy Green asked if Michelle had family she might have gone to visit. David said her mother lived in Social Circle, about 15 miles away, but Michelle's car was still here. Deputy Green stepped outside and radioed for additional units. He requested a supervisor and a detective. While waiting, he walked the perimeter of the property. The backyard was small, enclosed by that chain-link fence. A swing set stood in one corner, the swing hanging motionless in the breeze. A child's plastic truck lay on its side near the back steps. The gate in the fence was closed but not latched. Deputy Green opened it and looked into the woods beyond. Pine trees and underbrush stretched back into shadow. He closed the gate and returned to the front of the house. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at 12:55. She was with the Criminal Investigations Division and had worked cases in Newton County for 6 years. She spoke with David Parker on the front porch while Deputy Green secured the scene. Detective Chen took notes in a small spiral notebook, her handwriting careful and precise. She asked David about his morning again, and David's account remained consistent. She asked about Michelle's state of mind. David said Michelle had been tired lately, stressed about money and about Emma, who had been having nightmares and waking up several times each night. Detective Chen asked what the nightmares were about. David said he didn't know. Emma was too young to explain clearly. At 1:15, Detective Chen called Michelle's mother. Carol answered on the second ring. Detective Chen identified herself and asked if Michelle and Emma were there. Carol said no. She hadn't heard from Michelle since their phone conversation on April 10. Detective Chen asked what that conversation had been about. Carol hesitated, then said Michelle had mentioned having some problems at home. Detective Chen asked what kind of problems. Carol said marital problems, but she didn't want to get into details over the phone. Detective Chen said she understood and asked Carol to call immediately if she heard from Michelle. Carol promised she would. By 2 o'clock, more than a dozen law enforcement officers had gathered at the Elm Street house. A command post was established in the carport. Maps of the area were spread across the hood of a patrol car. Search teams were organized. The woods behind the property would be searched first, then the neighborhood surrounding Elm Street, then expanding outward in a grid pattern. Volunteers began arriving by 3 o'clock. Neighbors, church members, people who had never met Michelle but wanted to help. Patricia Hallbrook brought coffee and homemade cookies. The local news station sent a van. By 4 o'clock, Michelle's disappearance was the lead story on the evening broadcast. David Parker remained at the house throughout the afternoon. He sat on the front porch steps, his hands clasped between his knees, watching the search teams organize and depart. Detective Chen observed him from a distance. She noted in her report that David's affect seemed unusually flat for someone whose wife and child were missing. He didn't pace. He didn't make phone calls. He didn't ask questions about the search efforts. When Michelle's mother and sister arrived at 4:30, he stood but didn't approach them. Carol embraced him briefly. Jessica stayed several feet away, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The first search teams returned as darkness fell. They had found nothing in the immediate woods. No signs of disturbance, no clothing, no footprints in the soft earth near the creek that ran through the pine forest half a mile behind the house. The search would resume at first light. Detective Chen asked David if he wanted to stay with family that night. David said no. He would stay at the house in case Michelle came home. Detective Chen said she understood, but the house was now a potential scene and would need to be processed. David could stay, but he would need to remain in certain areas and not disturb anything. David agreed without argument. That night, crime scene technicians processed every room. They photographed everything. They collected fingerprints, hair samples, fibers from the carpet. They found Michelle's toothbrush in the bathroom, her clothes hanging in the closet, her shoes lined up neatly by the bed. They found Emma's clothes, her toys, her favorite stuffed elephant that she carried everywhere. They found nothing that suggested a struggle or a hurried departure. In the kitchen, they noted that half-full coffee mug again. It sat exactly centered on the counter, as if placed there with care. The coffee inside had separated, a thin film on top. The technicians photographed it from multiple angles. Clears throat. For those who have worked missing persons cases, there are patterns that emerge. People who leave voluntarily usually take certain items. Identification, money, a change of clothes, medications. People who are taken against their will usually leave signs of resistance, overturned furniture, broken items, marks on doors or windows. Michelle Parker's house showed neither pattern. Everything was in its place. Too much in its place, some of the technicians whispered to each other. Like someone had staged a scene, rather than lived in a space. The search continued through Sunday, April 13. More than 200 volunteers walked through fields and forests, calling Michelle's name, calling Emma's name. They checked abandoned buildings, old barns, drainage ditches. The local television coverage brought out more volunteers. Michelle's face appeared on the evening news, a photograph from her high school graduation, her smile bright and hopeful. Emma's face appeared beside it, a recent snapshot showing a small girl with dark curls and serious eyes. The tip line received dozens of calls. Someone thought they saw a woman matching Michelle's description at a gas station in Kinnears. Officers responded. It wasn't her. Someone else reported a child crying in a car at a Walmart parking lot in Covington. Officers responded. The child was with her parents. Detective Chen interviewed David Parker formally on Sunday afternoon. The interview took place at the Newton County Sheriff's Office. David agreed to come voluntarily. He did not request an attorney. The interview was recorded. Detective Chen asked David to walk through his Saturday morning again, minute by minute. David did so. His account remained consistent with what he had told Deputy Green and what he had told Detective Chen the day before. He woke at 6. He showered. He dressed. He made coffee. Michelle and Emma were still asleep. He left for work at 6:45. He arrived at the job site at 7:15. He worked until 11:30. He tried calling Michelle at 11 because she usually texted him by mid-morning and he hadn't heard from her. She didn't answer. He called again at 11:15. No answer. He told his supervisor he needed to go home. He arrived home just before noon. Michelle and Emma were gone. Detective Chen asked about the previous evening. David said they had eaten dinner around 6, spaghetti. Emma had been fussy, didn't want to eat. Michelle was quiet, they watched television for a while. Michelle gave Emma a bath around 7:30. Emma went to bed at 8. David and Michelle went to bed around 10. Detective Chen asked if they had argued. David said no. Detective Chen asked if Michelle had mentioned plans for Saturday. David said no. Detective Chen asked if Michelle had seemed afraid of anything or anyone. David said no. Detective Chen then asked about the vacuum cleaner. David looked confused. Detective Chen explained that the house appeared to have been thoroughly cleaned, the carpet freshly vacuumed, everything put away. She asked when that cleaning had been done. David said Michelle must have done it Friday night after he went to bed. She sometimes cleaned when she couldn't sleep. Detective Chen asked if that was a frequent occurrence. David said yes, Michelle had trouble sleeping, had for months. Detective Chen asked about the coffee mug. David said he didn't know anything about it. He said Michelle made coffee every morning. She must have poured herself a cup and then something happened. Detective Chen asked what he thought had happened. David said he didn't know. Maybe someone came to the door. Maybe Michelle went outside for some reason and someone took her and Emma. Detective Chen asked why Michelle would have gone outside without her purse or her car keys or her phone. David said he didn't know. His voice remained steady throughout the interview. He maintained eye contact. His hands rested calmly on the table. Deputies conducted a thorough background check on David Parker. No criminal record. No history of domestic violence calls to the residence, though that meant little given how often such incidents went unreported. They interviewed David's coworkers. Tom Reynolds said David was a good worker, showed up on time, did quality work. The other members of the roofing crew said David kept to himself mostly, didn't socialize much, but seemed like a decent enough person. They all confirmed that David had been at the job site Saturday morning from approximately 7:15 until 11:30. But there were small discrepancies that began to accumulate like drops of water slowly filling a glass. The job site in Monroe was 17 miles from the Elm Street house. Deputies drove the route multiple times at different speeds in different traffic conditions. The fastest they could make the trip was 22 minutes. The slowest was 31 minutes. David said he left work at 11:30 and arrived home just before noon. That gave him roughly 30 minutes. Possible, but tight. And if he had arrived home, found Michelle and Emma missing, and called emergency services at 12:14, that left only 14 minutes for him to search the house and determine they were gone. Detective Chen drove to the job site herself on Monday, April 14. She spoke with Tom Reynolds again. She asked him to be as specific as possible about the timeline that Saturday morning. Tom consulted his notes. He kept detailed records of crew hours for payroll purposes. He said David arrived at 7:18, not 7:15. He said David left at 11:26, not 11:30. Detective Chen thanked him and returned to her car. She sat in the parking lot doing calculations in her notebook. If David left the job site at 11:26 and arrived home just before noon, that still worked. But it was getting tighter. Michelle's cell phone records arrived on Tuesday. The last outgoing call was Friday night at 9:47. Michelle had called her mother. The call lasted 6 minutes. Carol confirmed this matched the conversation she remembered. The last incoming call was Saturday morning at 11:03, David calling from work. The phone records showed the call went unanswered. There was another call from David at 11:18, also unanswered. The phone had been charging in the kitchen when officers arrived. It showed no signs of damage or tampering. Michelle's bank account showed a balance of $212. The last transaction was Friday afternoon, a purchase at the grocery store for $38.62. Investigators obtained the security footage from that store. Michelle appeared on camera at 4:17 on Friday afternoon, April 11. She pushed a shopping cart containing Emma, who sat in the child's seat. Michelle selected items from the shelves, moved through the aisles, checked out at register 3. She paid with her debit card. She smiled at the cashier. She left. Nothing seemed unusual or distressed. The community vigil took place on Wednesday evening, April 16. More than 400 people gathered in front of the Newton County Courthouse. They held candles. They sang hymns. Michelle's pastor spoke about hope and faith. Carol spoke, her voice breaking as she pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Jessica spoke, describing her sister as loving and kind and devoted to Emma. David did not speak. He stood near the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, his face shadowed in the candlelight. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about David's demeanor. Some noted that he had not shed a single tear in their presence. He had not appeared frantic or desperate. He had not joined the search teams that continued to comb the woods and fields. He stayed at the house most days alone, while volunteers and officers searched. When reporters approached him for comment, he declined politely and went inside. The investigation continued through April and into May. Every lead was followed. Every tip was investigated. A psychic from Atlanta contacted the sheriff's office claiming to have visions of Michelle. She was ignored. A man in a neighboring county reported seeing a woman and child matching their descriptions at a rest stop. Officers responded. It wasn't them. The case began to consume resources. The sheriff held a press conference on May 1 announcing that, while the investigation remained active, they had exhausted immediate leads and were requesting continued public assistance. Detective Chen returned to the Elm Street house multiple times. She walked through the rooms. She stood in the kitchen looking at where that coffee mug had been. She went into the backyard and stood by the swing set. The swing hung still. The toy truck still lay on its side near the steps, exactly where it had been on April 12, as if frozen in time. She tried to construct scenarios in her mind. Michelle makes coffee. She pours a cup. Something happens. But what? And where is Emma during all of this? And why take Emma's favorite stuffed elephant, but leave her other toys behind? Detective Chen also noted something else during those visits. David had moved back into the house after the crime scene processing was complete, but he hadn't changed anything. Michelle's clothes still hung in the closet. Her shampoo still sat in the shower. Emma's room remained exactly as it had been. Most people, even those desperately hopping for a loved one's return, begin to shift things eventually. They pack items away, they clean, they try to reclaim the space. David did none of this. The house remained a museum to April 12, 2008. In June, the case was featured on a regional crime program. New tips came in. None led anywhere. In July, the FBI offered assistance with behavioral analysis. Their profile suggested that if Michelle had been harmed, it was likely by someone close to her, someone who had access to the house, someone who understood her routines. The profile suggested staging. The profile suggested premeditation. But without a body, without physical evidence, without witnesses, there was nothing to pursue. Clear's throat. The investigation slowly went cold. Detective Chen continued to work the case when she could, but other cases demanded attention. The search teams disbanded. The news coverage moved on to other stories. Michelle's face disappeared from the evening broadcasts. Carol visited the Elm Street house once in August. She asked David if she could take some of Michelle and Emma's belongings, things to remember them by. David said no. He said Michelle and Emma were coming home and their things should be waiting for them. Carol left without arguing, but she told her daughter Jessica that something about David's certainty troubled her deeply. Years passed, the calendar pages turned. 2008 became 2009, then 2010, then 2011. The Elm Street house stood quiet. David continued living there alone. He still worked for Reynolds Construction. He still drove the white F-150, though he had bought a newer model. He spoke to almost no one in the neighborhood. Patricia Hallbrook, the retired teacher who had waved to Michelle that last morning, occasionally saw David coming and going. She said he looked the same, unchanged, as if time moved differently for him than for everyone else. Carol filed a petition to have Michelle declared legally deceased in 2013. David opposed it. The court ruled in Carol's favor. Michelle Marie Parker was declared deceased as of April 12, 2008. A small funeral service was held. David did not attend. Emma was not declared deceased. The law made distinctions about children. The case remained open. Detective Chen retired from the Newton County Sheriff's Office in 2015. She had worked in law enforcement for 23 years. The Michelle Parker case was the one she couldn't solve, the one that haunted her. Before leaving, she organized all the case files meticulously. She wrote a detailed summary. She included her observations and her suspicions. She noted that David Parker had never wavered in his account, had never shown typical emotional responses, had never moved on with his life in any visible way. She noted that the house had been too clean. She noted the timeline was possible but extremely tight. She noted that sometimes the absence of evidence was itself evidence. She left the files for whoever might pick up the case next. That person turned out to be Detective Marcus Webb. He transferred to the Criminal Investigations Division in 2016. He was younger than Chen had been, 34 years old, with fresh eyes and new training in cold case methodology. He reviewed the Parker case files in early 2017. Something about it troubled him. He drove out to Elm Street. The house with the yellow shutters still stood. David Parker's truck was in the carport. Detective Webb sat in his car across the street, watching, thinking. David Parker's life had taken an unusual shape in those years after Michelle and Emma disappeared. He worked. He came home. He maintained the house. He mowed the lawn. He paid his bills, but he formed no new relationships. He joined no social groups. He attended no church. People who worked with him said he was reliable but distant. He ate lunch alone. He left immediately after his shift ended. On weekends, his truck remained parked in the carport. Curtains stayed drawn. For someone whose wife and child had vanished, leaving him theoretically free to move on, to start over, to build a new life, he seemed instead to be trapped in amber, preserved in the moment of their disappearance. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt that creeping unease that something is profoundly wrong even when you cannot name it, you understand the position Carol and Jessica found themselves in during those years. They wanted to believe David was innocent. They wanted to believe Michelle and Emma had somehow, impossibly, started a new life somewhere. But they couldn't escape the feeling that David knew more than he said. The way he had opposed declaring Michelle deceased. The way he kept the house unchanged. The way he never seemed to grieve. In 2018, 10 years after Michelle vanished, Jessica was going through old boxes at her mother's house. She found Michelle's high school yearbooks, photographs from their childhood birthday cards. At the bottom of one box, she found a journal Michelle had kept during the first year of her marriage. Jessica sat on the floor of her mother's guest room and read it. The entries were sporadic. Some described happy moments. Some described arguments. Some described fear. In an entry from October 2005, Michelle wrote that David had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks during an argument about money. In an entry from March 2006, Michelle wrote that she was afraid of David's temper, the way it could appear suddenly like a summer storm. In an entry from December 2007, Michelle wrote that she was thinking of leaving but didn't know how to do it safely. Jessica brought the journal to Detective Webb. He read it carefully. He photographed every page. He added it to the case file. It provided context, but it wasn't evidence of a specific crime. Thousands of people experience difficult marriages and contemplate leaving. That didn't mean their spouses had harmed them. Detective Webb knew he needed something concrete. He decided to re-interview everyone connected to the case. He started with Tom Reynolds. Tom was 63 now, semi-retired from Reynolds Construction. He met Detective Webb at a coffee shop in Monroe. Detective Webb asked him to think back to April 12, 2008. Tom did his best. He remembered David arriving that morning. He remembered David seemed quieter than usual. He remembered David checking his phone frequently. Detective Webb asked about the timeline again. Tom said he had given Detective Chen his notes back then, and those were accurate. David arrived at 7:18 and left at 11:26. Detective Webb asked if Tom remembered anything else unusual about that day. Tom thought for a long moment. Then he said there was something. He hadn't thought it was important at the time, but David's truck had been dirty that morning. The white F-150 that David kept so meticulously clean had mud on the tires and the lower panels. Tom remembered noticing it because it was so out of character. He had even made a joke about it, asking David if he'd been four-wheeling. David had said he'd driven down a dirt road the previous evening looking at a property for sale. Tom hadn't thought anything more of it. Detective Webb felt something shift in his chest. He kept his expression neutral. He asked if Tom could remember any other details about the truck. Tom said no, just the mud. Detective Webb thanked him and left. He returned to his office and pulled up the case file. He looked for any mention of David's truck being dirty. There was none. He looked through the crime scene photographs. The truck was visible in some of the shots from that first day. Detective Webb enlarged the images on his computer screen. The truck looked clean in those photographs. Spotless, in fact. Detective Webb sat back in his chair. If David's truck had been muddy Saturday morning when he arrived at work, but clean by the time officers responded to the house Saturday afternoon, that meant David had washed it sometime between 11:26 when he left the job site and 12:14 when he called emergency services. That was less than an hour. Where would he have washed it? And why would he have taken time to wash his truck when his wife and child were missing? Detective Webb began mapping car washes in the area. There were 3 between Monroe and Covington. He obtained records from all of them, though records from 2008 were long gone. He drove to each location. 2 were automated facilities. 1 was a self-service bay. He timed the drive from the job site to each car wash, then from each car wash to the Elm Street house. The self-service bay was the closest to the route David would have taken home. It would have added approximately 12 minutes to his travel time. Detective Webb constructed a new timeline. David leaves work at 11:26. He drives toward home but stops at the self-service car wash. He spends 8 to 10 minutes washing the truck. He arrives home at 12:05 or 12:07. He goes inside. He waits. At 12:14, he calls emergency services. The timeline was still possible, but it raised the question, why clean the truck? In March 2019, Detective Webb decided to approach the case from a different angle. He requested that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation re-examine all physical evidence collected from the scene. Technology had advanced significantly since 2008. DNA analysis was more sophisticated. Chemical testing could reveal traces that earlier methods might have missed. The GBI agreed to review the case. In May 2019, the results came back. Most of the evidence revealed nothing new, but one item caught the attention of the forensic team. The carpet sample taken from the trunk of Michelle's car showed minute traces of blood. The sample was degraded, and the amount was so small that 2008 technology had missed it entirely. The blood type matched Michelle's. The GBI could not definitively say how the blood had gotten there or when, but its presence was documented. Detective Webb requested permission to re-examine David Parker's truck. The white F-150 David had been driving in 2008 had been sold years ago, its current whereabouts unknown. But Detective Webb obtained a warrant to examine David's current vehicle. Forensic technicians processed it thoroughly. They found nothing. The truck was immaculate. Whatever secrets the 2008 vehicle might have held were gone. Detective Webb was running out of options. He had suspicions, but suspicions were not evidence. He had timeline discrepancies, but discrepancies were not proof. He had a journal describing marital problems, but that was not evidence of murder. He needed something definitive. In August 2019, he decided to try one more approach. He arranged to speak with David Parker directly. The interview took place at the sheriff's office on August 14, 2019. 11 years, 4 months, and 2 days after Michelle and Emma vanished, David Parker arrived voluntarily. He was 43 years old now. His hair had started to gray at the temples. He wore jeans and a work shirt. He sat across from Detective Webb in the same interview room where Detective Chen had questioned him in 2008. Detective Webb explained that he was reviewing cold cases and wanted to go over a few details about the morning of April 12, 2008. David's account remained unchanged. He woke at 6. He showered, he dressed, he made coffee. Michelle and Emma were asleep. He left for work at 6:45. He arrived at the job site at 7:15. Detective Webb stopped him there. He said the supervisor's records showed David arrived at 7:18, not 7:15. David shrugged. He said it had been a long time, maybe he remembered wrong. Detective Webb asked about the route David took to work that morning. David described going north on Highway 81. Detective Webb asked if David had stopped anywhere along the way. David said no. Detective Webb then asked about David's truck. He said witnesses remembered it being muddy that morning. David's expression didn't change. He said the truck might have been a little dirty, he couldn't remember. Detective Webb asked if David had washed the truck that day. David said maybe he washed the truck frequently. Detective Webb asked if David had washed it between leaving work and arriving home. David paused. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Then David said no, he went straight home. Detective Webb leaned forward. He said the timeline was very tight. David left work at 11:26. He called emergency services at 12:14. That was 48 minutes. Detective Webb had driven the route multiple times. It took between 22 and 31 minutes. That left David somewhere between 17 and 26 minutes at home before calling for help. Detective Webb asked what David had done during those 17 to 26 minutes. David said he searched the house. He looked for Michelle and Emma. He tried to figure out where they could be. Detective Webb asked if David had checked the backyard. David said yes. Detective Webb asked if David had checked the woods behind the property. David said he looked, but he didn't go into the woods. Detective Webb asked why not. David said he didn't know. He was confused. He wasn't thinking clearly. Detective Webb nodded slowly. Then he asked if David wanted to know what Detective Webb thought had happened on April 12, 2008. David said nothing. He sat motionless, his hands folded on the table. Detective Webb said he thought Michelle had told David she wanted him to move out. He thought David had become angry. He thought something had happened that Friday night or early Saturday morning before David left for work. He thought David had hidden Michelle and Emma somewhere, then gone to work to establish an alibi, then returned home and called the police, playing the role of the concerned husband. David listened without expression. When Detective Webb finished, David said one sentence, "I would like to speak with an attorney." The interview ended. David left. Detective Webb sat alone in the interview room, staring at his notes. He had pushed as hard as he could, and David had not broken. David had not confessed. David had requested an attorney, which was his right, and which also meant Detective Webb could not question him further without that attorney present. The case remained cold. Clear's throat. But something had shifted. Detective Webb's renewed investigation had generated new attention. The local news ran a story about the 11th anniversary of Michelle's disappearance. They interviewed Carol and Jessica. They mentioned the ongoing investigation. They asked anyone with information to come forward. The story aired on April 12, 2019. 3 weeks later, on May 3, 2019, a woman named Angela Torres called the tip line. She said she had information about the Parker case. She said she had been afraid to come forward before, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. Detective Webb called her back within an hour. Angela agreed to meet him. Angela Torres was 38 years old. She lived in Kinnears, about 15 miles from Covington. She worked as a nurse at a regional hospital. She told Detective Webb that in 2008 she had been dating a man named Marcus Riley. Marcus worked in construction and knew David Parker professionally. On Saturday, April 12, 2008, Marcus had come to Angela's apartment around 9 in the morning. He seemed agitated. He said David Parker had called him early that morning, around 6:30, asking for help moving some things. Marcus had gone to the Elm Street house around 7. He said David had some large plastic containers that needed to be taken to a storage unit. Marcus helped David load the containers into David's truck. Marcus said the containers were heavy and sealed. He didn't ask what was inside. Detective Webb asked why Marcus had helped David. Angela said Marcus owed David a favor, something about David lending Marcus money. Detective Webb asked if Marcus knew what was in the containers. Angela said Marcus claimed he didn't, but later, after Michelle was reported missing, Marcus became very quiet and withdrawn. Angela had pressed him about it. Marcus had told her to drop it. They broke up in June 2008. Angela hadn't seen Marcus since. Detective Webb asked why Angela was coming forward now. She said she had always felt guilty about not speaking up. She said she had been scared of getting Marcus in trouble, scared of getting herself involved. But over the years, the weight of it had grown. She couldn't forget Michelle's face in the news coverage. She couldn't forget thinking about that little girl. She said she hoped it wasn't too late. Detective Webb immediately began searching for Marcus Riley. He found him living in Macon, Georgia, about 90 miles south. Marcus was 46 years old, worked for a landscaping company, and had a minor criminal record for drug possession in 2012. Detective Webb drove to Macon with another investigator. They found Marcus at his apartment on May 8, 2019.